One nation, two Americas. Since the fall of Roe v. Wade, the United States has become a patchwork of abortion and pro-life laws. Half of our country took bold steps to protect babies in the womb and to support their mothers through pro-life legislation. In these states, children are being saved and lives are being changed. But what about the other half? The other half has gone the opposite direction. Some states have locked in abortion until the moment of birth. No limits, no safeguards, no conscience. Not only that, but in post-Roe America, abortions are actually increasing. So what's really happening on the ground? Why, after the largest pro-life legal victory in American history, are more children still losing their lives? What does this split reality mean? This podcast is Exposed: Abortion in America. And in season 4, we're exposing the dark side of abortion in post-Roe America. I'm Emily Erin Davis, and in this episode, we dive into the Tale of Two Americas. And this is Post-Roe, The Next Battle, season 4. The fight for life is far from over. To help us break all this down, we're joined today by someone who works in the thick of this legal battlefield. She's the Director of Legal Affairs at Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, and she works every day to craft and defend life-affirming laws while also sounding the alarm on the radical abortion regimes taking hold in states in our country. She's a legal strategist, a very sharp analyst, one of the nation's clearest voices on what post-Roe policy actually looks like, and not just in theory, but in practice, and I'm proud to call her a friend and colleague. Joining us now is Katie Glenn Daniel. Katie, glad to have you here. Thank you for joining me today.
It's so great to be here.
So let's start big picture. What does the legal landscape really look like 3 years after Dobbs? What are we looking at today?
Well, the biggest thing, as you mentioned, is that we have a world of contrast. So we have about half the country with laws that protect the unborn from 12 weeks or earlier. So about 12 states that protect babies throughout the pregnancy, a couple states like mine, Florida, where we have a heartbeat law, and then a few states that are protecting babies at 12 weeks. And then beyond that, there are some states that have a law at 20 weeks, which was the norm prior to the Dobbs decision. Some still say viability, which is a confusing term that has been moving forward based on advancements in science, but is typically considered around 22 to 24 weeks. And then there are states that have no limits, states like Colorado, where abortions are happening on full-term babies.
So, Katie, is it fair for us to then say the term two Americas? I mean, is that a fair way to describe this divide?
I think it is fair because you've got states where babies are protected, where not only they are protected, but there are all these different great things happening to support their moms. And then you have states like California, Illinois, New York, where you've got politicians pushing abortion actively, pushing it further and further in pregnancy, pushing the taxpayers to have to pay for it, and removing any type of safeguards, including things like giving moms accurate information about what the abortion is, the fact that it destroys their baby's life, and also the resources available to them. So it's sort of two mindsets. Are we going to live in a world where we are striving towards thriving families and helping moms and their babies? Or are we living in a world where abortion is pushed as the solution to every problem?
Right. So you mentioned this already, but several states now do allow abortion through all 9 months for any reason. Not what they would say an emergency. They would openly say elective for any reason. Do you think the voters in these states are aware that these laws exist or how radical they are? And so that's question number 1. And question number 2, do you think that they realize how radical they are in the context internationally too, and how much of a global pariah their states are put up against other countries around the world?
I don't. I think that most people believe that even if that's allowed in the state, it doesn't actually happen. And we actually saw this about a year ago, where a reporter interviewed Dr. Warren Kern. He recently retired. There was a period of time where he was the latest term abortion provider in the United States. And he actually confused the reporter. She asked a question where she said, if somebody came in and they said they don't want a little girl, but I'm, at 36 weeks pregnancy, would you perform that abortion? And he answered, yes, he would. The reporter got confused, thought he said no, he would not, and had to clarify that, in fact, he was open to that. He said, even if this baby could survive without a problem, if mom just came into a hospital delivering that baby, you'd consider 36 weeks full term. If she says, I don't want a girl, he would be willing to end that child's life. And the reporter was pretty shocked by that. But I think it perfectly illustrates the mentality that most people have, which is this isn't happening. Well, if it is happening, it's only in the saddest, most tragic situations, and I'm fine with that. When the reality is these guys will go on the record and say they have no qualms about performing these for any reason at all.
Right. And I find that really interesting too, because there's not this data that points to that. In fact, you're not going to find studies or data that say that late-term abortions only happen in the rarest or most emergency of circumstances. It either is ambiguous or it points to the opposite. So that for me is a huge disconnect as well.
Well, and to your second point, we're so disconnected from the rest of the world. We in the United States are one of just 8 countries where that abortion on demand for any reason throughout any moment of pregnancy is legal. And I think a big reason for that is because of Roe versus Wade. Other countries that did not have this mandate from on high from their courts that actually grappled with this through the legislative process, through the democratic process, most of them landed, and the vast majority of them landed at a spot that is either fully protective or around the first trimester. Almost none of them ended up where we are post-Dobbs, which is that even some states now think that it's a good thing that these abortions be permitted throughout pregnancy.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I genuinely believe and know that most people in the States have no idea how much of an outlier the U.S. is when it comes to abortion at large and our laws surrounding it, and especially when you factor in the states that have later or all 9-month abortions. I mean, it's such an anomaly on the global scale. One of the most shocking things that we've seen is that some of the states are actually stripping away protections. So other types of laws, not just abortion limits, but parental consent or informed consent, even waiting periods. There's so many other laws that people don't think about when we're talking about abortion legally. And so I think that this is something else that is important to factor in and to discuss to make sure people are aware of. What are some of those basic laws? Can you kind of go into the ones I just mentioned? And then why are they so important?
That's right. The vast majority of Americans, like people around the world, will never interact with the infrastructure that is the abortion industry. And so in our minds, we probably think that it is sort of like going to a normal doctor's office. Of course, they're doing things that I really disapprove of. They're ending the life of babies, but the way they operate is pretty much the same. I think most Americans do believe that. If you actually get behind the doors and you understand what's going on, this is completely different. And we see that as lawyers most frequently in the courts and in the state houses, where these guys are constantly lobbying, saying, well, I know that you have parental consent generally in medicine, but parental consent should not apply to us. Minors should not have to have their parents involved in this very, very important decision. And they stress the decision is so very important that the individual needs to be making it. Whereas I would look at it the opposite. The decision is so very, very important that the parents have to be involved. And yet, there's a website right now that's suing the state of Missouri, arguing that they should be able to send text messages to minors and direct them on how to get these life-altering and life-ending for the baby procedures without mom and dad knowing. They are filing a lawsuit against the state of Missouri saying their phone app should be able to function without mom and dad knowing.
Wow.
Even though the vast majority of Missourians were told by this campaign before they went to the polls last fall, parental consent will not be affected.
I do want to get into that. So that is something that I know you can speak to firsthand in some of your previous work about this kind of bait and switch, and specifically in regards to the ballot measures that we saw. So I'm thinking about like a Michigan or Ohio. It was as if in order to get people to vote or to sign off on these abortion ballot measures, they told them one thing, and especially in regards to like parental consent, like, oh, don't worry about that. It's fine. It's fine. And then after these laws get on the books, then they're coming back and trying to change things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
That's right. Michigan, before the ballot initiative Prop 3 was passed, had one of the most robust informed consent processes in the country. It was actually one that we used to point to other states. And we'd say, you should look at what Michigan's doing. They've got really good ideas. And a big part of that was they had a website built out that had all this information, including information about your alternatives. So in the comfort of your own home, without any kind of pressure, like, hey, this appointment's running long, you could take a look at that and get direct access to people who wanted to help you with parenting or adoption. Governor Whitmer comes into office. She says, I don't like any of that. She's a very pro-abortion governor. And when Prop 3 passed, she said, we're taking all of that off the website. People don't need that information. And in fact, there are now lawsuits saying that if the state provides any information whatsoever about alternatives, that's coercive.
So alternatives to... Sorry, could you describe that a little bit more for people to understand? When we're talking about informed consent, it's making sure that women are aware of their alternative options to abortion, correct?
Right. So it has information about state-funded programs, whether it's how do you apply for Medicaid for you and your baby, or what type of housing options are available. If you're a pregnant student, what are your rights at your college or university or at your high school even. Just general information about what your rights and the resources available to you are. It also historically included information about pregnancy centers in the state, who could help with all kinds of different, resource gaps that the state might not be able to, including things like material resources, groups that will give you a crib and clothes and diapers. All of that was stripped off the state's website.
So all of that got scrubbed?
Yes.
Wow. Under the justification of it just needs to be sort of this pro-abortion mindset, pro-abortion push?
Right. What they argued in court is that any information the state provides that might make a woman hesitate to follow through with the abortion is considered coercive, and therefore the state cannot provide her with that information.
Wow. So that is what is really important to highlight here when we're talking about different laws, because as I understand it, it was represented that would not happen, that none of those things would be in contention. But then as soon as the ballot passed, then you start to see these changes. And I think we can also point to examples of that when it comes to parental consent being removed, right?
That's right. Parental consent has been a big one that we've seen in these campaigns when parents are, their votes are up for grabs. It's said over and over, consent will not be impacted. This is not part of the issue. We're only talking about adults. And yet this language is crafted very carefully to not apply to adults, to apply to minors as well. And we started seeing these lawsuits where they say, the language says individual, therefore that includes minors. The exact thing that I was arguing in the campaigns with their attorneys, saying, of course this will apply to minors. Look at the legal history here. Mm-hmm. They were saying, no, it won't. And then they've come around and done the exact thing that I warned that they would do.
Right. Yeah, which is so troublesome if you're a parent. I mean, you may be a parent and you're saying to yourself, well, I'm relatively, a quote unquote pro-choice person, or even if you're pro-abortion, it doesn't mean that you want your parental consent or even notification stripped to where you can't even know if your child is being marketed to for abortion, if they're going to get an abortion. And by that, we mean not only are they not asking for your consent in some of these places, they're not even going to notify you.
Right. They actively lobby against laws that would require notification. This has just come up in Montana, where the voters, by a huge margin, passed a parental notification law that Planned Parenthood went into court and got their state Supreme Court to invalidate.
Wow.
Saying even though 2/3 of the voters think that parents should even be told, be sent a letter in the mail, something that's not even meaningful enough to stop the procedure, which they want to do same day, but just that parents know after the fact, so that if their child is struggling emotionally, so that if their child has many of the known and foreseeable complications that can arise either from the surgery or from taking these drugs, that mom and dad might be clued into what's going on. They filed a lawsuit all the way to the Montana Supreme Court saying parents can't even have a right to know. And they won.
Oh, wow. Oh, man. Well, you said something just a second ago about waiting periods. Can you also kind of share what are waiting periods in this context and why are those also being taken away as well?
So this is another area where the abortion industry differs significantly from mainstream healthcare. If you're having a surgery or if you're taking a drug that has certain contraindications, you're often not going to do it on the same day. Even relatively minor things like a dental surgery is going to be scheduled for a different day. Mm-hmm. And that's for lots of reasons, right? It might be so that you can consider your options. Is this something I want to do? Do I want a second opinion? It could just be for scheduling. It's not typical that they're like, okay, let's rush you in. You're here. And it could be because you need to think through the financial implications of it. It's not typical at all that they'll say things like, well, if you come back next week, we're going to charge you again for the ultrasound. But that's the kind of predatory marketing that I know you've covered on the show in past seasons, mm-hmm. where there's this pressure, the time pressure, the financial pressure, that makes it not that surprising that Planned Parenthood, on their annual report, they say 97% of pregnancy resolution services are an abortion because they're pressing you 10 different ways to get it done right now while you're here because they don't want to lose your money. And right. So some states, to try to normalize the situation, to try to take that pressure off, they pass laws called a reflection law, where they say, you've got to wait 24 hours or 48 hours, enough time to give you a breath to leave the building and say, is this really what I want to do? Before you're just rushed in. There are also practical considerations for an abortion later in pregnancy. You shouldn't be doing it the same day because you may not be properly prepared for anesthesia. If you've ever had the surgery, they tell you not to eat in the morning. If you had breakfast before you came in, you may not be a good candidate that day. So there are practical medical reasons, but also just the emotional piece. Do you want to talk this over with your partner or your family? In our red states, a lot of them have that waiting period. In the blue states, they've uniformly gotten rid of it because they see it as an impediment. Anything that might give you the time to cool off and say, maybe this is not what I want to do, or maybe I want to go home and think about it, they remove what they see as a barrier to selling the abortion.
Doesn't that stand in direct contrast to what a well-informed choice would be?
Well, I would say yes. The idea, what we hear is, well, by the time women show up, they've made up their mind. So anything that would slow this process down is getting in the way of the decision they've already made.
But how could that be when you have unique circumstances that day that you just laid out? And a lot of people don't even know, who the person performing it would be, what the center looks like on the inside, what the actual surgery itself will entail, what the risks of the drugs are. These are black box drugs, according to the FDA. I mean, how would that be?
Well, that's exactly the thought process behind these states that have said this reflection period is so necessary because, first of all, we know many women show up and they don't know They genuinely think they're there for information, and they don't realize they're going to be pitched on a hard sale of a product. And so for those women, but also for the ones who come in very determined, and maybe they see that baby on the ultrasound, or maybe they hear about the risks and they say, whoa, I need to slow down for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
They deserve that time and space to consider this more fully as well.
I also think about, and we've reported on this, just the fact that Planned Parenthood itself is well known and documented. This is well documented to be an area where traffickers frequently take women to seek abortions for them. So that forced and coerced side of things. And so that waiting period can make all the difference for that woman.
Absolutely. We've heard that's where he took me because they don't ask questions. Sadly, that is a common story you hear from women who have been rescued from a trafficking or abuse situation, is that this is the place to go because nobody asks any questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is why these laws are so important and significant. And I'm so glad that we do see those protected in the pro-life states if there are certain, limits like a heartbeat or a pain-capable law, which so either a 6-week or a 12-week. A lot of people are surprised that abortions have increased since Roe. And we're talking a lot about just different laws, but hearkening back to the limits conversation we were having a little bit earlier in this episode, I mean, people are kind of shocked and surprised about the number of abortions increasing, myself included, since the fall of Roe v. Wade. So what do you think, in your expert opinion, what's driving that, and what can we do?
Well, I think the single driver is that these drugs were allowed to be sent through the mail. So for the first 23 years that abortion drugs were on the market, you had to get them in person from a certified prescriber. So someone who had filled out paperwork with the FDA, with the manufacturer, and would see you in person. Mm-hmm. And using COVID as the excuse, the industry really pressed on the Biden administration to remove that, what they saw as a major barrier to sales. Just as much as we've talked about the hard sell that they do in person, it's a lot easier to just say, fill out some information online and we'll ship you these in 3 days. And oh, by the way, send us your money. That is so much more streamlined. So it is completely prescriber driven. It is all to their benefit, not at all to the benefit of the woman who they're selling this to, or the man they might be selling it to, because their lawyers went in front of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and said, you can just do this on the internet. You don't need to ever have a video visit. You don't need to check ID. So it's even that much more divorced from typical healthcare now that these drugs are online. So now we've got people who are ordering them by the dozen, and you can find websites where they make that possible, even though the FDA has clearly said you should not be prescribing, quote unquote, in advance, which means one woman should be getting one prescription. The reality of these websites is that they're being purchased at a much faster clip. We're seeing more and more stories of them being used in abusive situations, purchased by men to commit crimes. So I think that's the biggest reason at all. We saw some states where they were able to protect babies and shut down the clinics very quickly, and that's awesome. But then you've got these other states like New York and California that are protecting these online pill sellers and saying, sell them as fast as you can, make all the money you can get, and then donate it to our campaigns. And so you've got that imbalance. And our hope is that we can get really these pill mills, because they're not operating as medical clinics. They are just sellers. We can get this to heal, and then we will see a reversal, and we'll see that total number go back down.
Yeah, and it's really frightening. I mean, these are the same drugs that the FDA itself said have a 1 in 25, right, will go to the ER as a result of taking these drugs.
Yes, even under the quote-unquote best circumstances, in the drug trials. They said 1 in 25 women will present to a hospital. There's emerging data that shows that the actual rate in real world experience is much higher than that. Could be as much as 1 in 10. So consider for a minute, if you're told, hey, you could take this and, 96% of the time go to the hospital, 4% you will. Okay, sounds like pretty good odds. Now, what if you're told 1 in 10 are going to the hospital? That's a lot more women.
Right.
So we know that women are not being presented with that information, certainly by these sellers. They're trying to make the sale. They're not giving you information that will detract you from the sale. But what we are seeing, what many of our doctor friends are seeing, is many, many thousands of women presenting in the ER with problems from these abortions.
And that really paints the picture of two Americas as well, because it looks as if you have these blue states with these, I mean, they don't have to be doctors. They could be really legitimately anybody shipping these drugs into these pro-life states kind of just willy-nilly. I can't get this image out of my head of one of the stories. It might have been Washington Post. And she's over there just kind of using duct tape to wrap up a package where she's just put the drugs in.
That's right. The Daily Caller just did a huge expose. They ordered from a bunch of different websites to see what kind of quality control there might be. Because in theory, the whole idea of our FDA existing, the Food and Drug Administration, is that no matter where you source a medication from, if it is FDA approved, it ought to be the same no matter what. That is the whole purpose for that public health agency. So she bought from several different websites, and one of them just sent little white pills in an envelope. No label, no child-proof bottle, just white pills in an envelope. And that is so representative of this situation. So I think when people say, why are the numbers up? When there are people out there selling drugs in little white envelopes, the numbers are up because those kind of people have no concern whatsoever for following the types of basic safety rules that would slow you down on your sales.
Yeah, I remember that exact article now. That one in particular really bothered me. They all bother me, but that one really felt dystopian because in that packet, it had a note handwritten that said, "Wish you the best," which is terrifying.
Sure they do.
Well, it's just terrifying to see that handwritten note accompanied by these, dangerous drugs. As per the FDA's own recommendation, they are black box drugs with a 1 in 25 bare minimum that could send you to the ER with a note saying, "Wish you the best." If that doesn't accurately describe what's going on between the two Americas, I don't know what is, because that's just really terrifying to think about a young woman or a girl in her house. Her parents don't know. She's receiving this, package in the mail, and that's what she reads before she ingests them.
Right. The doctor in New York says, "Wish you the best." It's the doctor in Louisiana who's caring for her and her baby and the complications she's suffering in the emergency room.
Right. Yeah, it's terrifying. I know we've talked a lot here about all kinds of different legislation, Katie, and different legal avenues that have happened post-Roe, especially the difference between the two Americas. If listeners want to make a difference, at the state level or just in general in their own communities, what do you think is the most important or urgent thing that they can do right now?
Well, I think the first thing, honestly, is to start having these conversations at home. Educate yourself. You can go to our website, sbaprolife.org, the Lozier Institute, lozierinstitute.org, and there are many other great resources. But understand the problems and understand what's going on in your state so that you can have these conversations. I live in a ballot state, Florida, so I was having lots of conversations like this with my friends and family before the election, and it was really interesting hearing the way people processed this information. For so long, we just had Roe v. Wade, and that was that, and I think a lot of people didn't spend that much time thinking about these two Americas and thinking about what I want the laws to be in the state where I live. What kind of protections do I want for moms and babies here in Florida or wherever you live? Now we get a say. That's what the Dobbs decision did. It said that we get a say. And so you have a real opportunity to share information with the people in your life. And if you're a parent, especially, to make sure that your child knows the dangers of these drugs, because these websites are targeting kids, and we have to be realistic about that.
And I guess finally, Katie, what is your hope for two Americas? Do you want us to stay divided in this way? I think not. But what is your wish for two Americas?
My hope is that in the states that have protective laws, people come to appreciate that. And we're seeing that they do. We're seeing polling that's starting to show that when people do think about it, they are much closer to us as pro-lifers than they are to the extreme agenda that people like Kamala Harris took out on the campaign trail last fall. So my hope for states like mine that have protective laws is that we can continue to be protective. My hope for the states that don't is that their citizens start to have that conversation. Because what we've seen internationally is that when there is a democratic lawmaking process, people end up a lot closer to the pro-life side and much more open to protecting babies. So, of course, my ultimate goal is a world where there are no abortions, where it's unthinkable. And there would be so many good things that would come from an unthinkable abortion mindset. Mm-hmm. But in the short term, I think it's that the democratic process does play out. And I think the younger generation in particular can have a really big role with that, coming up against these entrenched Democratic politicians who say, no limits or bust. That's not where most Americans are.
Yeah, and I think we saw that acutely after the election, in which it was just a repudiation of the Democrats and Kamala Harris in particular as the figurehead, where their campaign, almost exclusively in a lot of these ads focused on abortion. And so voters said no. And we're seeing really encouraging data, even in the latest Gallup polling, about young people really swinging towards more of a pro-life stance on this. And so we just got to continue, like you said, to have these conversations in this post-Roe America in so much that we can not be two divided parts of a nation, but hopefully heal to become one on this understanding of protecting babies in the womb and serving moms. Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining me today, and really appreciate you kind of diving right into the legal landscape, and hopefully we'll get to talk to you again in a future episode sometime.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the second episode of our new podcast season, Post-Roe, The Next Battle. Join us this entire series as we hear from experts, legislators, and people on the ground who share the realities of abortion in our country today. A huge thanks to Katie Daniel for joining us today to discuss all of the legal landscape post-Roe. But the Tale of Two Americas isn't just about the laws themselves, but really how they impact women and their children. About the babies whose right to life right now depends on a zip code. And it's about what each of us is willing to do to bring justice, mercy, and truth to a post-Roe world that's far from settled. But the fight doesn't stop at laws and legislation. In our next episode, we're going to pull back the curtain on a coordinated legal and political assault on pregnancy resource centers, those lifelines of hope and compassion that serve women every day. From vandalism to lawfare, these centers are under attack, and we'll expose what's happening, who's behind it, and why the same places that are offering free ultrasounds, diapers, housing, compassion, why they are now being targeted as enemies by abortion activists and lawmakers. For Exposed, Abortion in America, this is Post-Roe, The Next Battle.